Chapter 6. At 7 o'clock, the Baron, seeing his brother, his son, the Baroness, and Hortense all engaged at whist, went off to applaud his mistress at the opera, taking with him Lisbeth Fischer, who lived in the Rue du Doyenne, and who always made an excuse of the solitude of that deserted quarter to take herself off as soon as dinner was over. Parisians will all admit that the old maid's prudence was but rational. The existence of the maze of houses under the wing of the old Louvre is one of those protests against obvious good sense which Frenchmen love, that Europe may reassure itself as to the quantum of brains they are known to have, and not be too much alarmed. Perhaps without knowing it, this reveals some profound political idea. It will surely not be a work of supererogation to describe this part of Paris as it is even now, when we could hardly expect its survival, and our grandsons, who will no doubt see the Louvre finished, may refuse to believe that such a relic of barbarism should have survived for 36 years in the heart of Paris and in the face of the palace where 3 dynasties of kings have received, during those 36 years, the élite of France and of Europe. Between the little gate leading to the bridge of the Carrousel and the Rue du Musée, every one having come to Paris, were it but for a few days, must have seen a dozen of houses, with a decayed frontage where the dejected owners have attempted no repairs, the remains of an old block of buildings of which the destruction was begun at the time when Napoleon determined to complete the Louvre. This street and the blind alley known as the Impasse du Doyenne are the only passages into this gloomy and forsaken block, inhabited perhaps by ghosts, for there never is anybody to be seen. The pavement is much below the footway of the Rue du Musée, on a level with that of the Rue Froidmanteau. Thus, half sunken by the raising of the soil, these houses are also wrapped in the perpetual shadow cast by the lofty buildings of the Louvre, darkened on that side by the northern blast. Darkness, silence, an icy chill, and the cavernous depth of the soil combine to make these houses a kind of crypt, tombs of the living. As we drive in a hackney cab past this dead alive spot, and chance to look down the little Rue du Doyenne, a shudder freezes the soul, and we wonder who can lie there, and what things may be done there at night, at an hour when the alley is a cut-throat pit, and the vices of Paris run riot there under the cloak of night. This question, frightful in itself, becomes appalling when we note that these dwelling-houses are shut in on the side towards the Rue de Richelieu by marshy ground, by a sea of tumbled paving stones between them and the Tuileries, by little garden plots and suspicious-looking hovels on the side of the great galleries, and by a desert of building stone and old rubbish on the side towards the old Louvre. Henri III and his favourites in search of their trunk-hose, and Marguerite's lovers in search of their heads, must dance sarabands by moonlight in this wilderness overlooked by the roof of a chapel still standing there, as if to prove that the Catholic religion, so deeply rooted in France, survives all else. For 40 years now has the Louvre been crying out by every gap in these damaged walls, by every yawning window, "Rid me of these warts upon my face." This cut-throat lane has no doubt been regarded as useful, and has been thought necessary as symbolizing in the heart of Paris the intimate connection between poverty and the splendor that is characteristic of the Queen of Cities. And indeed these chill ruins, among which the Legitimist newspaper contracted the disease it is dying of, the abominable hovels of the Rue du Musée, and the hoarding appropriated by the shop stalls that flourish there, will perhaps live longer and more prosperously than 3 successive dynasties. In 1823, the low rents in these already condemned houses had tempted Lisbeth Fischer to settle there, notwithstanding the necessity imposed upon her by the state of the neighborhood to get home before nightfall. This necessity, however, was in accordance with the country habits she retained, of rising and going to bed with the sun, an arrangement which saves country folk considerable sums in lights and fuel. She lived in one of the houses which, since the demolition of the famous Hotel Cambacérès, command a view of the square. Just as Baron Hulot set his wife's cousin down at the door of this house, saying, "Good night, cousin," an elegant-looking woman, young, small, slender, pretty, beautifully dressed, and redolent of some delicate perfume, passed between the wall and the carriage to go in. This lady, without any premeditation, glanced up at the Baron merely to see the lodger's cousin, and the libertine at once felt the swift impression which all Parisians know on meeting a pretty woman, realizing, as entomologists have it, their desiderata. So he waited to put on one of his gloves with judicious deliberation before getting into the carriage again, to give himself an excuse for allowing his eye to follow the young woman, whose skirts were pleasingly set out by something else than these odious and elusive crinoline bustles. "That," said he to himself, "is a nice little person whose happiness I should like to provide for, as she would certainly secure mine." When the unknown fair had gone into the hall at the foot of the stairs going up to the front rooms, she glanced at the gate out of the corner of her eye without precisely looking round, and she could see the Baron riveted to the spot in admiration, consumed by curiosity and desire. This is to every Parisian woman a sort of flower which she smells at with delight if she meets it on her way. Nay, certain women, though faithful to their duties, pretty and virtuous, come home much put out if they have failed to cull such a posy in the course of their walk. The lady ran upstairs, and in a moment a window on the second floor was thrown open, and she appeared at it, but accompanied by a man whose bald head and somewhat scowling looks announced him as her husband. "If they aren't sharp and ingenious, the cunning jades," thought the Baron. "She does that to show me where she lives. But this is getting rather warm, especially for this part of Paris. We must mind what we are at." As he got into the milord, he looked up, and the lady and the husband hastily vanished, as though the Baron's face had affected them like the mythological head of Medusa. "It would seem that they know me," thought the Baron. "That would account for everything." As the carriage went up the Rue du Musée, he leaned forward to see the lady again, and in fact she was again at the window. Ashamed of being caught gazing at the hood under which her admirer was sitting, the unknown started back at once. "Nanny shall tell me who it is," said the Baron to himself. The sight of the government official had, as will be seen, made a deep impression on this couple. "Why, it is Baron Hulot, the chief of the department to which my office belongs!" exclaimed the husband as he left the window. "Well, Marneffe, the old maid on the third floor at the back of the courtyard, who lives with that young man, is his cousin. Is it not odd that we should never have known that till to-day, and now find it out by chance?" "Mademoiselle Fischer living with a young man?" repeated the husband. "That is porter's gossip. Do not speak so lightly of the cousin of a councillor of state, who can blow hot and cold in the office as he pleases. Now, come to dinner. I have been waiting for you since 4 o'clock." Pretty, very pretty, Madame Marneffe, the natural daughter of Comte Montcornet, one of Napoleon's most famous officers, had, on the strength of a marriage portion of 20,000 francs, found a husband in an inferior official at the War Office. Through the interest of the famous Lieutenant General, made Marshal of France 6 months before his death, this quill driver had risen to unhoped-for dignity as head clerk of his office. But just as he was to be promoted to be deputy chief, the Marshal's death had cut off Marneffe's ambitions, and his wife's, at the root. The very small salary enjoyed by Sieur Marneffe had compelled the couple to economize in the matter of rent, for in his hands Mademoiselle Valérie Fortin's fortune had already melted away, partly in paying his debts, and partly in the purchase of necessaries for furnishing a house, but chiefly in gratifying the requirements of a pretty young wife, accustomed in her mother's house to luxuries she did not choose to dispense with. The situation of the Rue du Doyenné, within easy distance of the War Office and the gay part of Paris, smiled on Monsieur and Madame Marneffe, and for the last 4 years they had dwelt under the same roof as Lisbeth Fischer. Monsieur Jean-Paul Stanislas Marneffe was one of the class of employees who escape sheer brutishness by the kind of power that comes of depravity. The small, lean creature with thin hair and a starved beard, an unwholesome, pasty face, worn rather than wrinkled, with red-lidded eyes harnessed with spectacles, shuffling in his gait and yet meaner in his appearance, realized the type of man that anyone would conceive of as likely to be placed in the dock for an offense against decency. The rooms inhabited by this couple had the illusory appearance of sham luxury, seen in many Paris homes, and typical of a certain class of household. In the drawing-room, the furniture covered with shabby cotton velvet, the plaster statuettes pretending to be Florentine bronze, the clumsy cast chandelier merely lacquered, with cheap glass saucers, the carpet whose small cost was accounted for in advancing life by the quality of cotton used in the manufacture, now visible to the naked eye, everything down to the curtains, which plainly showed that worsted damask has not 3 years of prime, proclaimed poverty as loudly as a beggar in rags at a church door. The dining-room, badly kept by a single servant, had the sickening aspect of a country inn. Everything looked greasy and unclean. Monsieur's room, very like a schoolboy's, furnished with the bed and fittings remaining from his bachelor days, as shabby and worn as he was, dusted perhaps once a week, that horrible room where everything was in a litter, with old socks hanging over the horsehair seated chairs, the pattern outlined in dust, was that of a man to whom home is a matter of indifference, who lives out of doors, gambling in cafes or elsewhere. Madame's room was an exception to the squalid slovenliness that disgraced the living-rooms, where the curtains were yellow with smoke and dust, and where the child, evidently left to himself, littered every spot with his toys. Valerie's room and dressing-room were situated in the part of the house which, on one side of the courtyard, joined the front half, looking out on the street, to the wing forming the inner side of the court backing against the adjoining property. Handsomely hung with chintz, furnished with rosewood, and thickly carpeted, they proclaimed themselves as belonging to a pretty woman, and indeed suggested the kept mistress. A clock in the fashionable style stood on the velvet-covered mantelpiece. There was a nicely fitted cabinet, and the Chinese flower stands were handsomely filled. The bed, the toilet table, the wardrobe with its mirror, the little sofa, and all the ladies' frippery bore the stamp of fashion or caprice. Though everything was quite third-rate as to elegance or quality, and nothing was absolutely newer than 3 years old, a dandy would have had no fault to find but that the taste of all this luxury was commonplace. Art, and the distinction that comes of the choice of things that taste assimilates, was entirely wanting. A doctor of social science would have detected a lover in 2 or 3 specimens of costly trumpery, which could only have come there through that demigod, always absent, but always present if the lady is married. The dinner, 4 hours behind time to which the husband, wife, and child sat down, betrayed the financial straits in which the household found itself, for the table is the surest thermometer for gauging the income of a Parisian family. Vegetable soup, made with the water haricot beans had been boiled in, a piece of stewed veal, and potatoes sodden with water by way of gravy, a dish of haricot beans, and cheap cherries, served and eaten in cracked plates and dishes, with the dull-looking and dull-sounding forks of German silver. Was this a banquet worthy of this pretty young woman? The Baron would have wept could he have seen it. The dingy decanters could not disguise the vile hue of wine bought by the pint at the nearest wine-shop. The table napkins had seen a week's use. In short, everything betrayed undignified penury, and the equal indifference of the husband and wife to the decencies of home. The most superficial observer, on seeing them, would have said that these two beings had come to the stage when the necessity of living had prepared them for any kind of dishonor that might bring luck to them. Valerie's first words to her husband will explain the delay that had postponed the dinner by the not disinterested devotion of the cook. "Samanon will only take your bills at 50%, and insists on a lien on your salary as security." So poverty, still unconfessed in the house of the superior official and hidden under a stipend of 24,000 francs, irrespective of presents, had reached its lowest stage in that of the clerk. "You have caught on with the chief," said the man, looking at his wife. "I rather think so," replied she, understanding the full meaning of his slang expression. "What is to become of us?" Marneffe went on. "The landlord will be down on us tomorrow. And to think of your father dying without making a will! On my honor, these men of the Empire all think themselves as immortal as their emperor." "Poor father," said she. "I was his only child, and he was very fond of me. The Countess probably burned the will. How could he forget me when he used to give us as much as 3 or 4,000 franc notes at once, from time to time? We owe 4 quarters' rent, 1,500 francs. Is the furniture worth so much? That is the question, as Shakespeare says." "Now, good-bye, ducky," said Valerie, who had only eaten a few mouthfuls of the veal, from which the maid had extracted all the gravy for a brave soldier just home from Algiers. "Great evils demand heroic remedies." "Valerie, where are you off to?" cried Marneffe, standing between his wife and the door. "I am going to see the landlord," she replied, arranging her ringlets under her smart bonnet. "You had better try to make friends with that old maid, if she really is your chief's cousin." The ignorance in which the dwellers under one roof can exist as to the social position of their fellow lodgers is a permanent fact which, as much as any other, shows what the rush of Paris life is. Still, it is easily conceivable that a clerk who goes early every morning to his office, comes home only to dinner, and spends every evening out, and a woman swallowed up in a round of pleasures, should know nothing of an old maid living on the 3rd floor beyond the courtyard of the house they dwell in, especially when she lives as Mademoiselle Fischer did. Up in the morning before anyone else, Lisbeth went out to buy her bread, milk, and live charcoal, never speaking to anyone, and she went to bed with the sun. She never had a letter or a visitor, nor chatted with her neighbors. Here was one of those anonymous, entomological existences such as are to be met with in many large tenements, where, at the end of 4 years, you unexpectedly learn that up on the 4th floor there is an old man lodging, who knew Voltaire, Pilatre de Rosiers, Beaujon, Marcel, Mole, Sophie Arnould, Franklin, and Robespierre. What Monsieur and Madame Marneffe had just said concerning Lisbeth Fischer, they had come to know in consequence partly of the loneliness of the neighborhood, and of the alliance to which their necessities had led, between them and the doorkeepers, whose goodwill was too important to them not to have been carefully encouraged. Now, the old maid's pride, silence, and reserve had engendered in the porter and his wife the exaggerated respect and cold civility which betrayed the unconfessed annoyance of an inferior. Also, the porter thought himself in all essentials the equal of any lodger whose rent was no more than 250 francs. Cousin Betty's confidences to Hortense were true, and it is evident that the porter's wife might be very likely to slander Mademoiselle Fischer in her intimate gossip with the Marneffes, while only intending to tell tales. When Lisbeth had taken her candle from the hands of worthy Madame Olivier, the portress, she looked up to see whether the windows of the garret over her own rooms were lighted up. At that hour, even in July, it was so dark within the courtyard that the old maid could not get to bed without a light. "Oh, you may be quite easy. Monsieur Steinbock is in his room. He has not been out even," said Madame Olivier, with meaning. Lisbeth made no reply. She was still a peasant, in so far that she was indifferent to the gossip of persons unconnected with her. Just as a peasant sees nothing beyond his village, she cared for nobody's opinion outside the little circle in which she lived. So she boldly went up, not to her own room, but to the garret, and this is why. At dessert, she had filled her bag with fruit and sweets for her lover, and she went to give them to him, exactly as an old lady brings home a biscuit for her dog. She found the hero of Hortense's dreams working by the light of a small lamp, of which the light was intensified by the use of a bottle of water as a lens. A pale young man, seated at a workman's bench covered with a modeller's tools, wax, chisels, rough-hewn stone, and bronze castings. He wore a blouse, and had in his hand a little group in red wax, which he gazed at like a poet absorbed in his labours. "Here, Wenceslas, see what I have brought you," said she, laying her handkerchief on a corner of the table. Then she carefully took the sweetmeats and fruit out of her bag. "You are very kind, mademoiselle," replied the exile in melancholy tones. "It will do you good, poor boy. You get feverish by working so hard. You were not born to such a rough life." Wenceslas Steinbock looked at her with a bewildered air. "Eat, come, eat!" said she sharply, "instead of looking at me as you do at one of your images when you are satisfied with it." On being thus smacked with words, the young man seemed less puzzled, for this indeed was the female Mentor whose tender moods were always a surprise to him, so much more accustomed was he to be scolded. Though Steinbock was 29, like many fair men, he looked 5 or 6 years younger, and seeing his youth, though its freshness had faded under the fatigue and stress of life in exile, by the side of that dry, hard face, it seemed as though nature had blundered in the distribution of sex. He rose and threw himself into a deep chair of Louis XV pattern, covered with yellow Utrecht velvet, as if to rest himself. The old maid took a green-gage and offered it to him. "Thank you," said he, taking the plum. "Are you tired?" said she, giving him another. "I am not tired with work, but tired of life," said he. "What absurd notions you have!" she exclaimed with some annoyance. "Have you not had a good genius to keep an eye on you?" she said, offering him the sweetmeats, and watching him with pleasure as he ate them all. "You see, I thought of you when dining with my cousin." "I know," said he, with a look at Lisbeth that was at once affectionate and plaintive. "But for you I should long since have ceased to live. But, my dear lady, artists require relaxation." "Ah, there we come to the point," cried she, interrupting him, her hands on her hips, and her flashing eyes fixed on him. "You want to go wasting your health in the vile resorts of Paris, like so many artisans who end by dying in the workhouse. No, no. Make a fortune, and then, when you have money in the funds, you may amuse yourself, child. Then you will have enough to pay for the doctor and for your pleasure, libertine that you are." Wenceslas Steinbock, on receiving this broadside, with an accompaniment of looks that pierced him like a magnetic flame, bent his head. The most malignant slanderer, on seeing this scene, would at once have understood that the hints thrown out by the Oliviers were false. Everything in this couple, their tone, manner, and way of looking at each other, proved the purity of their private life. The old maid showed the affection of rough but very genuine maternal feeling. The young man submitted, as a respectful son yields to the tyranny of a mother. The strange alliance seemed to be the outcome of a strong will acting constantly on a weak character, on the fluid nature peculiar to the Slavs, which, while it does not hinder them from showing heroic courage in battle, gives them an amazing incoherency of conduct, a moral softness, of which physiologists ought to try to detect the causes, since physiologists are to political life what entomologists are to agriculture. "But if I die before I am rich?" said Wenceslas dolefully. "Die!" cried she. "Oh, I will not let you die. I have enough life for both, and I would have my blood injected into your veins if necessary." Tears rose to Steinbock's eyes as he heard her vehement and artless speech. "Do not be unhappy, my little Wenceslas," said Lisbeth with feeling. "My cousin Hortense thought your seal quite pretty, I am sure, and I will manage to sell your bronze group, you will see. You will have paid me off, you will be able to do as you please, you will soon be free. Come, smile a little." "I can never repay you, mademoiselle," said the exile. "And why not?" asked the peasant woman, taking the Livonian's part against herself. "Because you not only fed me, lodged me, cared for me in my poverty, but you also gave me strength. You have made me what I am. You have often been stern, you have made me very unhappy." "I?" said the old maid. "Are you going to pour out all your nonsense once more about poetry and the arts, and to crack your fingers and stretch your arms while you spout about the ideal and beauty and all your northern madness? Beauty is not to compare with solid pudding. And what am I? You have ideas in your brain? What is the use of them? I too have ideas. What is the good of all the fine things you may have in your soul if you can make no use of them? Those who have ideas do not get so far as those who have none, if they don't know which way to go. Instead of thinking over your ideas, you must work. Now, what have you done while I was out?" "What did your pretty cousin say?" "Who told you she was pretty?" asked Lisbeth sharply, in a tone hollow with tiger-like jealousy. "Why, you did." "That was only to see your face. Do you want to go trotting after petticoats? You who are so fond of women, well, make them in bronze. Let us see a cast of your desires, for you will have to do without the ladies for some little time yet, and certainly without my cousin, my good fellow. She is not game for your bag. That young lady wants a man with 60,000 francs a year, and has found him. Why, your bed is not made!" she exclaimed, looking into the adjoining room. "Poor dear boy, I quite forgot you." The sturdy woman pulled off her gloves, her cape and bonnet, and remade the artist's little camp bed as briskly as any housemaid. This mixture of abruptness, of roughness even, with real kindness, perhaps accounts for the ascendancy Lisbeth had acquired over the man whom she regarded as her personal property. Is not our attachment to life based on its alternations of good and evil? If the Livonian had happened to meet Madame Marneffe instead of Lisbeth Fischer, he would have found a protectress whose complaisance must have led him into some boggy or discreditable path, where he would have been lost. He would certainly never have worked, nor the artist have been hatched out. Thus, while he deplored the old maid's grasping avarice, his reason bid him prefer her iron hand to the life of idleness and peril led by many of his fellow countrymen. This was the incident that had given rise to the coalition of female energy and masculine feebleness, a contrast in union said not to be uncommon in Poland.